Good evening. I'm Peter Mehegan. Welcome to Harvard University for a debate on foreign policy issues sponsored by the Boston Globe and by Harvard's Institute of Politics in association with WCVB-TV. In the next half hour, Democratic presidential candidates will take questions from the public and from reporters and university professors on foreign policy issues tonight. First, let us introduce the candidates. Seated left to right, they are Senator Alan Cranston of California, the Reverend Jesse Jackson, former Senator George McGovern of South Dakota, Senator Gary Hart of Colorado, Senator John Glenn of Ohio, former Vice President Walter Mondale, and Senator Ernest Hollings of South Carolina. In our first segment tonight, we'll take questions from the public, beginning with a question for Mr. Jackson.
Mr. Jackson, given the recent heightened concern about your relationship with the Arab world, what new role, if any, would you have Israel play in the Middle East conflict?
Number one, we have, from an American point of view, the 22 nations in the Middle East, we have an interest in relating adequately to all of them. 110 million people, and we must relate to all of them. We have an obligation, it seems to me, to support Israel's right to exist with security within internationally recognized boundaries. Secondly, to support Palestinian justice. And thirdly, normalize ties with the Arab world. As a superpower, we have an interest in having an adequate relationship so as to protect reconcile our interests. Our interests are economic, political, military, geopolitical, and economic, and we must reconcile all of them.
Next, a question for Mr. Cranston.
Yes, Senator Cranston. Do you believe that the United States normalizing diplomatic relationships with Cuba is a prerequisite to achieving peace in Nicaragua and El Salvador?
No, I don't think that normalizing relationships with them is a prerequisite to achieving peace in El Salvador and Nicaragua. I believe that we should stop trying to overthrow the government of Nicaragua. I believe we should stop backing the brutal dictatorship in El Salvador, one that, according to the Catholic bishops, has killed with its assassination squads more than 30,000 innocent political opponents, most of them unarmed, most of them killed with American arms and ammunition. I think we have to start, if we want to improve, and we do, relations with Cuba, with the Soviet Union. Straighten out relations with them, and then it will flow that we can improve our relations with others. I think we should follow the Contadora process. Our friends in Central America recommend that outsiders, and they mean we and the Cubans, stop intervening militarily in Central America. There are some signs that Castro might be willing to do that if we were willing. I think we should put that to the test, and if he's willing to withdraw military advisors, we should also, and that could be the beginning of a better relationship, and it could be the beginning of peace in Central America.
Our next question goes to Mr. Hart.
Senator Hart, what specific problems did you find with President Carter's human rights policy, and how would you modify those?
The policy is and must be, or ought to be, the policy of this nation. I think the problem, as it was applied by the previous administration, was that it wasn't applied equally to our so-called friends as it was to our enemies. We courted and supported the Shah of Iran at a time when he was not modernizing his country, certainly not fast enough. We continued the support for President Marcos in the Philippines at a time when he was not making any steps to democratize his country. We continued the armament and aid for a repressive government in South Korea. And I'm afraid we continued throughout the world to support repressive governments merely because they were anti-communist and did not bring to bear the full weight of the moral authority of this country to bring democratic and ideals and principles to our foreign policy.
How would you modify that?
Well, we have about 10 seconds.
I'm sorry. What I would do is apply those principles equally to our supposed friends or those whose support we need in our worldwide effort to bring democracy, as well as those with whom we are clearly in disagreement.
Our next question goes to Mr. Hollings.
Senator Hollings, how can we best support the Contadora group?
I think we should go along with the Contadora recommendations. They want to remove military forces from both sides in Nicaragua and trying to make it an area of peace rather than an area of war down there in Central America. And they have called for direct negotiations with all parties and none of these preconceived or preconditions. I think that's the particular route to go, but especially since they are more directly interested, more directly informed, and more directly affected by any policy that would be put in force down in Central America, it's been a bad mistake by this administration not to treat them as allies and friends, but almost treating them as the enemy itself.
Our next question goes to Mr. Mondale.
Mr. Mondale, given our history as a nation and our unique position in the world today, what values do you believe are worth dying for, and therefore what kinds of situations do you think would warrant the deployment of U.S. armed forces overseas?
First of all, the principle has to be that force should be used as a last resort and not a first resort. There have been occasions in history, and there may well be occasions again, where the preeminent security, fundamental interests of our country, security interests, treaty interests will require combat. Certainly, World War II would be the classic example of a struggle where the whole basis of Western society, civilization, democracy, fundamental rules of human justice were so fundamentally at stake that no alternative existed. I would say the war in Vietnam was a classic example, as is the covert action in Nicaragua, of an effort that was totally without justification and counterproductive in the most fundamental of senses. And it is the fundamental issue of our time, however, is to prevent war, and particularly nuclear war, because if that type of war begins, that's the end of the human species.
Our next question goes to Mr. McGovern.
Senator McGovern, we have all heard your criticism of President Reagan's foreign policy. Yet during the previous administration, we encountered a period which saw the Soviets invade Afghanistan, the hostage crisis in Iran, and a general consensus that the foreign policy of the United States was weak and vacillating. How would your foreign policy differ from that of the last Democratic administration?
I think the basic weakness of American foreign policy for about 35 years under both Republican and Democratic administrations is that it's based too much on what we're against and not enough on what we're for. In other words, it's been based on anti-communism. And in that sense, we've had a tendency to embrace every tin-horn dictator around the world who waved an anti-communist banner. You know, no matter what kind of a scoundrel they were, whether it was Diem in South Vietnam, or Marcos in the Philippines, or Pinochet in Chile, or now this corrupt, murderous gang in El Salvador, we throw our arms around them on the grounds that they're anti-communist. As a consequence, it is a self-defeating effort in which the Soviets emerge as the champion of revolutionary change and improvement in the lives of people, and we get stuck with these oppressive dictators who are trying to cling to a status quo that's going to go anyway.
Our next question is for Mr. Glenn.
Senator Glenn.
Just a quick word against applause, because it's going to chew up our valuable time. Thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Glenn.
Senator Glenn. How do you see the U.S. role as a seller of arms to developing countries? What is the effect on the countries, and what is the effect on U.S. foreign policy and interests, especially in sensitive areas such as Pakistan and India, Greece and Turkey?
And all in 60 seconds, good. I'd hope we could cut down the sales of arms by hoping to cut down the tension between nations in these different areas around the world. I think if we look at long-term programs that we can put into these countries to help nations develop, so there's not as much repression as hunger and lack of medical help and things like that, perhaps we lessen the tension between countries in those areas. And that to me is the long-term solution to much of this. I think the same thing occurs in Central America, where we are too prone to ignore what has caused there to be some receptivity for communism in those areas. Why are people going off into the hills? It's because they don't have enough to eat, or enough medical help, or no education for their children sometimes. So I would hope to see us cut down on these things by some of the long-term aid we can give.
Next tonight, we are going to take some questions from newspaper reporters and from Harvard professors who have a special expertise in foreign policy issues. And our first question is from Karen Elliott House of the Wall Street Journal, and the question goes to Mr. Mondale.
Senator Mondale, you, the United States, and you in particular, is committed to the survival of a Jewish state in a largely Muslim Middle East. We now have Marines in Lebanon trying to protect the Christian government there until it makes an accommodation with the Muslims in Lebanon. How committed would you be as president to protecting a Christian enclave in the Middle East if those negotiations don't produce something that allows the Christians to survive on their own?
As you know, some weeks ago I called for the withdrawal of our ground troops in Lebanon because I think they're there without a policy, exposed to tragedy. Yesterday, yet another young American has lost his life. In my opinion, your question puts your finger on the very problem. What you have is a government in Beirut that represents just a faction, a minority faction of the population of Lebanon. For nearly a year, there was an opportunity, much better than it exists today, to press Jamal with strong incentives and efforts to open up, to bring in the Druze, the Shiites, the Sunni Muslims, and so on, to try to get the beginnings of an acceptable underlying political agreement which adjusts from the earlier agreement, which needs to be done to reflect current population and current reality. Because that hasn't been done, all we have is a deep fractional dispute that produces more war. What is missing, what is needed now, is a tough new diplomatic initiative.
But if the diplomacy doesn't work, I'm asking you, should we become committed as a country to protecting a Christian enclave the way we are to protecting a Jewish enclave?
First of all, let me say very clearly, I believe that the country of Israel is a legitimate nation. It serves our security interests. It is our friend. It is a real country and a real government. I see a big difference between that and this fledgling Jamal government that is yet to get its act together in a way that provides a real basis for
So the answer is no, is that right?
I see a big difference, and I would continue to give, well, I have given them a chance, I would give them a chance, but I think those ground troops have to come out of there. I would leave the naval forces there, and a long time ago, I would have used the power of the presidency to try to press them to get going. They haven't done that.
The next question is from Ezra Vogel of Harvard University, who is an expert on international trade, and his question goes to George McGovern.
Senator McGovern, we've just learned that last year our trade imbalance was $69 billion. Some people estimate this year it will be close to $100 billion or perhaps more than $100 billion. Clearly we're having a serious problem with international competitiveness. Do you believe our companies, our private enterprise, are able to do it alone, or do you think our government needs to play a bigger role in promoting competitiveness? And if so, what should our government role be?
Well, I think one of the biggest problems is the overvalued dollar. The effect of having this highly inflated dollar is to put about a 25% tariff against the goods we're trying to sell abroad, somewhere between 22 and 25%. And it works in reverse to place about a 22 to 25% discount on commodities that are coming in here from other countries. So we get it in the neck both ways. Our products are penalized by the overpriced dollar abroad, just as imports are advantaged by that dollar. I think the second problem is more of a management failure in private industry than anything else. The fact that we've concentrated too much on financial management, on tax dodges, and on acquiring other corporations, and not enough on productivity, on developing products that are innovative and improved and modern and that can remain competitive with those of other countries.
As for the overvalued dollar, if you take the baseline as you do of the last several years, that's right. But if you take the baseline as 1971, the dollar is now worth 50% less than it was. Do I conclude that you therefore feel the government has no important role in promoting competitiveness?
No, I think the government does have an important role. For example, I would favor using the tax system to reward industries that improve their productivity, not those industries that are using tax write-offs simply to buy other corporations, but modernizing plant, improving the equipment. That's one of the reasons I think protection is not the answer. If we use protection as a way of dealing with this problem, that's going to postpone the modernization process of our own plants that will make our products more competitive.
Our next question comes from William Beecher, the foreign affairs writer for the Boston Globe. Mr. Beecher's question goes to Alan Cranston.
Senator, one of your fellow candidates, Jesse Jackson, was successful in interceding with the Syrians to get the release of Lieutenant Robert Goodman. Do you think it would make sense for you or any of the other Democratic candidates to make a trip to Moscow to see if you could intercede with Soviet leaders about improving U.S.-Soviet relations?
I don't think as a presidential candidate I or the others should go to Moscow at this time. The basic responsibility for handling relations with the Soviet Union lies with the present president and those that he has appointed. That's why we need a change. That's a prime reason why I am running for president, because this president, Ronald Reagan, does not understand that most of the problems in the world do not stem from communism, as he seems to think. They stem from poverty, from tyranny of the right wing, from inequality and injustice.
Would your answer be the same, sir, once the Democratic Party has selected a nominee?
I doubt that the nominee should take off for Moscow either. But the moment there is a president, if I am that president, I will get in touch on January 20th, 1985 with the Soviet leader and urge that we get together immediately to stop this nonsense and figure out how to get rid of these weapons. And secondly, I will announce that day that the United States will stop testing and deploying nuclear weapons as long as the Soviets refrain. That requires no negotiations. We would know at once if they tested or deployed. That's exactly the way the only significant breakthrough thus far in arms control has occurred. President John F. Kennedy in 1963 announced, "We will not test nuclear weapons in the air if the Soviets refrain and other nations refrain." Khrushchev replied in 5 days, "We accept," and a treaty was instantly negotiated.
The next question is from Gregory Treverton of Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government, who was a consultant to the Kissinger Commission's report on Central America. His question goes to John Glenn.
Mr. Glenn, the situation in Central America, including in El Salvador, seems to continue to deteriorate. That may force us to confront alternatives that we would find unpleasant. My question is, under what circumstances, if any, would you be prepared to tolerate in El Salvador a government that was aligned with Cuba that looked something like the current Sandinista regime in Nicaragua?
Well, I think you'd have to make an assessment at that time what the threat was to this country. Just the fact that the government might not be exactly what we would like it to be there is not enough to say that we would militarily intervene there. But let's say there were missiles going in and they were being aimed at our cities and so on. That would be a whole different situation. It's been a very confusing policy that this administration has had, if it's been a policy. We say we support the Contadora proposals there, and yet we support the Contras. There have been several different sets of proposals made by the Contadora group, and certainly we can get some sort of negotiation started there. In El Salvador itself, we've had some 2/3 of the deaths since 1979, some 30,000 deaths, have occurred not from the communist Marxist guerrilla-led group up in the hills, but has come from the right-wing paramilitary death squads operating too often with impunity out of government circles themselves. That's a horrible number of deaths. If we applied that to our population, it would be about 1,400,000 deaths from that source. I had an amendment passed in the Foreign Relations Committee that would force the government of El Salvador to come up with a plan of how they're going to deal with that as a very first step toward getting peace in El Salvador.
Does that suggest that if a government that came to power in El Salvador was, say, no worse than the current Sandinista regime in terms of exporting revolution to its neighbors, that you would be prepared to tolerate it, or at least wouldn't go very far in trying to oppose it?
Not sure I understand. If the government of El Salvador was changed to do what now?
If a government came to power in El Salvador, which looked very much like the current Sandinista regime in Nicaragua, was somewhat perhaps ambiguously engaged in support for revolution, but not very much, how far would you go in opposing that government in El Salvador?
Well, I think that's such a hypothetical question, and I don't know that I could give you a direct answer on it right now, but because we see some signs that perhaps in Nicaragua, there are some signs of giving in that area. Now, they've opened up some dialogue with the Catholic Church, for instance. They've asked the Cubans to get out recently. There has been some movement there that I think we should jump on and try and negotiate rather than just saying that we're drawing a hard line there on Nicaragua, we'll go no further. So there has been a considerable give there, and if that same thing applied over in El Salvador, obviously I would propose the same thing there. We try and work with that government.
Karen House of the Wall Street Journal has a question for Jesse Jackson.
Mr. Jackson, if a group took over Saudi Arabia that was not compatible with our interests, is this a part of the world in which you'd be willing to use force?
As a last resort, I think that we would have to look at the condition. We do have an interest in Saudi Arabia. We do have diplomatic ties with Saudi Arabia, and the appeal by that government would have a lot to do with what we should do. We should certainly not move in
No, I'm talking
against
about
their
a
will.
situation in which that government doesn't exist. Some new government exists that is believed to be contrary to our interests. You don't have long in situations as we saw in Iran.
Well,
to do something.
is it different if it's a government that emerged from within rather than without? We'd have to relate to it differently, because if it came from within, we'd have to respect its sovereignty and try to negotiate a new relationship and cultivate a relationship that would be to our interests. We certainly could not impose our will.
Regardless what the political leanings of that government were, or its desires to export oil or not export oil.
We certainly are in no position to occupy such a government. I think what we must do is to make certain in the Arab world, for example, that we have the kind of relations that lessen the chance of that happening. That's why any time that we have any kind of strategic economic or military alliance that does not protect our collective interests, the day before, we set ourselves up for that kind of tragedy the day after. Any strategic military economic alliance in that area must protect all of our interests before such an occurrence were to be.
Professor Ezra Vogel now has a question for Ernest Hollings.
Senator Hollings, Japan and many European countries are now targeting certain industries they give special assistance to in the form of subsidies, research, information gathering, marketing, tax incentives. So far, we've been largely waiting and trying to impose countervailing duties that are often too late to be of help to the industry. What would you propose to do in response to other countries who target certain sectors?
My response, sir, would be to enforce the present trade laws. We have been lethargic rather than the countervailing duties coming so late. We've held back on the trigger price mechanism. We've held back on the anti-dumping provision. And the fact of the matter is, when you go all the way to the United States Supreme Court, like the Zenith Color TV case, and the government itself, namely the White House, settles the case behind the back of the industry, 10 cents on the dollar. So the first order of business, yes, as you indicate, we can help with the research. Not necessarily with the marketing other than the XM Bank. I have supported right along beefing up the Export-Import Bank so that we could have a fair basis for free trade. But more than anything else like that, change the attitude of our national government to put it on the side of American industry and American jobs, because we are right now in a trade war. They're using, as your question indicates, every weapon, and it's time that we develop a fair basis for free trade.
I quite agree with you that we're in a kind of trade war that's not adequately recognized, and I wonder whether that, what you suggested, is a strong enough response. If it's that serious, aren't there other more positive things we should do besides just promote more research and more XM Bank? Are there other things that we ought to be doing?
If I were king for a day of the president in the next 10 minutes, I would have, as you have a National Security Council, I'd have a National Trade Council to coordinate within that Trade Council effort, State Department, Treasury, Commerce, Labor, Agriculture. We would then have a Food and Fiber Board as counseling that particular effort. We'd have the different other groups counseling labor and business. And within that council itself, then we'd have a real continuity of trade policy, which wouldn't be weak at all. They'd know that I meant business, and this is the main thing that we have, not a bunch of new laws. We could take the same ambassador for trade and put him as the director of that particular council right at this minute. And I think that's the way to do it, is to work along with the Congress, feeling your way as you move.
Next, William Beecher has a question for Gary Hart.
Senator, many analysts contend that both the United States and Western Europe have to spend considerably more money to beef up their conventional forces in order to decrease reliance on nuclear weapons. Looking at it from an economic and political point of view, if you were president, how would you seek to accomplish that?
First of all, I would disengage the debate about conventional forces from the traditional and I think increasingly counterproductive and irrelevant debate between liberals and conservatives about whether we ought to spend more or ought to spend less. I would focus, as the military reform movement has in Congress, rather on non-budgetary items. For example, our practices in personnel retention and training and promotion of our officer corps to place emphasis on retaining the skilled personnel and training officers to be battlefield commanders, not business managers. I would then change our strategy and tactics and doctrine in Europe, which I think are all wrong and prepared to fight World War II. And third, I would purchase weapons that are affordable in greater numbers and affordable to maintain and operate.
But you're only talking about American forces. What about Western Europe? Because the brunt of the spending would have to be there.
Well, the same principles apply, actually, because we are in an alliance. And one of the things we find now is that the European economy, I thought an article written today was in the New York Times was very good about that. The European economy, like ours, is dependent to a degree on procurement of military weapons. And the Europeans are increasingly unhappy with us because they're being forced to buy American weapons at about 6-to-1 ratios over what they produce for the alliance. And I think the same principles of reform ought to apply to our European allies.
Quick one, do you think it's possible to restore a position of détente between the United States and the Soviet Union? If so, quickly, how?
Oh, I believe it's imperative. Détente merely means reduce tensions, and if we don't have that, then I think we're going to have increasing likelihood of war.
Okay, we have just a couple of minutes left in this segment, and Gregory Treverton has a chance now to clear up any loose ends he chooses to with any of the candidates.
This is really a question for all of you briefly. It's difficult to talk about defense budgets in numbers, but certainly the size of Mr. Reagan's proposed increases, 10 or even more percent in real terms per year, have been very controversial. What for each of you is the right number for the percentage increase, if any, in American defense budgets in the next several years?
I do not think there should be an increase. Ronald Reagan has gotten our defense budget far higher than we need to defend ourselves and defend our way of life. There should therefore be a decrease, and that can come about by cutting out weapon systems we do not need and negotiating with the Russians for further cuts.
I think
they're going to have to be in the order of 15 seconds or so. Go ahead.
I think that we must focus more on the cost overruns of the military budget, which we're not doing. It's beyond $500 billion, some projections are. Secondly, there must be a new formula with the European-Japanese relationship. Where they were 40 years ago and where they are today has changed. And
So
thirdly,
we spend less overall ourselves. We would spend less overall ourselves.
Indeed, we should spend less overall, because if we reduce the cost overrun, alter that formula based upon their new economic ability, and take out these MX, B-1, and nerve gas systems that are unnecessary, we could increase our defense and reduce our defense spending.
Okay. Governor.
I think if we eliminated the overkill, eliminated the surplus weapons, and the enormous waste in the military procurement side of the Pentagon, we could cut and should cut our military spending on the order of 25%.
Real nuclear arms reduction, which has to happen in the 1980s, combined with the kind of military reform in our conventional forces that I mentioned, and finally investing in what needs to be done to train and maintain our personnel and the readiness of our conventional forces, leads to a reduction of about $100 billion in the next 2 to 3 years.
Difficult to put a specific percentage onto it as you propose. The first duty of government is to keep our people alive and independent and free, number one. When I put the systems all together and look at them, I come out with some that are not necessary that would mean we could cut about $15 billion from the defense budget. The MX, the Rapid Deployment Force, Bradley Fighting Vehicle, Division Air Defense, all total up about $15 billion. And that would reduce somewhat, but I disagree completely with Reagan's proposal for 11, 17, or Weinberger's 22%.
Senator, I'm going to have to jump in, and we're going to have to give both you gentlemen a chance to play catch-up, because we're about to start the live portion of this, and we're going to have a clean beginning here. So we're going to, the folks at home will have no idea what we're talking about. So you could Good evening, and welcome to Harvard University. Tonight, 7 men who want to be the next President of the United States will debate foreign policy questions. They will take questions from newspaper reporters and university professors, and the candidates will have an opportunity to question one another. First, to introduce the candidates tonight. Seated left to right, they are Senator Alan Cranston of California, Reverend Jesse Jackson, former Senator George McGovern of South Dakota, Senator Gary Hart of Colorado, Senator John Glenn of Ohio, former Vice President Walter Mondale, and Senator Ernest Hollings of South Carolina. In our first segment tonight, each candidate will take a question and a follow-up question from one of our foreign policy experts. The first question is from Harvard University professor Ezra Vogel, who is an expert in international trade, and it goes to Gary Hart.
Senator Hart, Japan has made no secret of the fact that it's challenging the United States for leadership in high-tech areas like computers, telecommunications, biotechnology. Yet Japan is also our very staunch ally. How do we forge a policy that will keep us competitive and also keep Japan as our ally?
About a year ago or more, I drafted, with the help of the semiconductor industry in this country, a proposal called, it was a new approach to negotiations between ourselves and the Japanese, particularly called national treatment. That proposal would have the President of the United States and his representative seek an agreement with the Japanese using all the bargaining tools at our command that would have American technology treated in Japanese markets as if that technology were produced in Japan. That has been the basis for the new policy of negotiating technology and trade agreements, or technology and service agreements. And I think had we a president in office who understood that approach, we could fundamentally alter the relationship.
Would you specify what you mean by understand that approach? What would be different from the way it is now?
Well, I don't see, frankly, that this administration is using much leverage at all on the Japanese to improve our trade imbalance with them. I think there is some hand-holding and perhaps even some hand-wringing, but very little tough bargaining, and almost none on the basis of that national treatment approach which I suggested.
The next question is from William Beecher of the Boston Globe, who specializes in foreign policy issues, and his question goes to Walter Mondale.
Mr. Mondale, one of the administration's allegations is that the Soviet Union is building a radar which could conceivably be used as the basis for a large-scale anti-ballistic missile system in the Soviet Union. If after becoming president, you became convinced that in fact they were deploying a large ABM, which would be a violation of the ABM treaty, what would you do?
If the Soviets were knowingly and deliberately committing a substantial or significant violation of a treaty, that would be about as serious a thing as a president confront. The situation here, however, I believe is different. Over the history of all the arms control agreements, there has been a committee called the Standing Consultative Committee, where the Soviet Union and the United States meets periodically to review charges and countercharges of treaty compliance. Over 20 years, that has worked splendidly. As a matter of fact, there have been no serious unresolved issues of compliance during that period. Now, for 2 years, this administration has barely used that commission. They've been reluctant to bring any charges before it because they don't want to legitimize the SALT Treaty or the ABM Treaty, and issues like this have been resolved in the past. The first thing I would do as president, if I had concerns of this kind, is to call a meeting, grind away and resolve them so that we can make certain that these treaties are being complied with.
A problem that has plagued nuclear arms control performance over the last several years in both Republican and Democratic administrations has been a notable lack of bipartisanship. If you become president, how would you seek to ensure bipartisan support for what you negotiate?
Well, first of all, as a United States Senator, I always extended bipartisan support to arms control, and most of us seated here did. I supported Nixon on SALT I, I supported him ABM. Although I thought Vladivostok was inadequate, I still supported it. And I would hope that a large section of the Republican senators would go along with my leadership. There's a strong, national, powerful, overwhelming demand in this country, found across the board, Republicans or Democrats, to control nuclear weapons. What we need is presidential leadership. In the past, we've had every president of both political parties has done something to reduce the risks until this president came along. He has radically departed from that shared bipartisan commitment. I would restore it, seek a freeze, and put arms control at the very, very top of my agenda.
Our next question will be asked by Gregory Treverton of the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. He was also a consultant to the Kissinger Commission on Central America. His question goes to Ernest Hollings.
Mr. Hollings, as we search for peace in Central America, suppose that the Cuban government came to you as president and said that it wanted to establish full diplomatic relations with the United States. Under what conditions would you say yes?
I would welcome that initiative, number one. I would approve of that relationship, number two, on the basis of them stopping the exporting of violence and Marxism the world around. The military intervention in Angola, all the way up to Ethiopia, they went to Nicaragua, and they're the ones that really been taking advantage, which we all know, of the hunger and the deprivation and the lack of health care and what have you, stirring up revolution. And as long as we could get an accommodation and work it out in a sensible fashion, you've got to save Castro's face. You don't want him to eat crow. But if he came like that, that would almost be like Sadat going to Jerusalem, and I'd bend over backwards to try to get that moving in that direction.
So you would not necessarily require him to withdraw all Cuban forces from Angola?
Oh, that's what I would start requiring. I would say, bam, we're not going to do it, and then have a deadline there, and if you didn't do it by a certain date and everything else, you've got to be reasonable, you've got to be human. If he made that kind of initiative, I would try to make some kind of initiative to save his face, to allow it gradually to be done. But definitely have him withdrawn, surely.
And would you respond similarly to a similar kind of initiative from the Sandinista government in Nicaragua?
Oh, yes, surely. In fact, we should be talking to them now, and that's our trouble. That's why I said earlier in this broadcast about the Contadora group. I think we should be approaching it from that direction.
Karen Elliott House of the Wall Street Journal also specializes in foreign affairs, and her question goes to John Glenn.
I'm fascinated that in the part of this discussion that unfortunately our TV audience didn't get to see, or some of them didn't, that Mr. Jackson wrote off Saudi Arabia, Mr. Mondale wrote off El Salvador, and Lebanon, and you seem to have come close to writing off El Salvador. But I want to ask again on that same line, a force question about...
that misrepresents my point of view.
Oh, and mine too. And mine too.
My question is the same one I asked Mr. Mondale. We are committed to supporting the Jewish enclave or Jewish state in the largely Muslim world. How committed would you be as president, if at all, to the survival of a Christian enclave in the Middle East if negotiations underway now between the Christians and the Muslims in Lebanon don't produce a settlement?
We don't have a specific state in the Mideast that is called a Christian state, as Israel is called a Jewish state. And so it's a matter of having Christian enclaves in different areas. Obviously, we don't want to see them killed any more than we want to see people killed in Israel. And I'm hoping that Mr. Jamal can see fit to go ahead and push very hard to get negotiations going so that they can get their new constitution, get all the different elements represented there so that we won't face an annihilation of any particular group. There's some 17 different religious factions involved in Lebanon. There are 42 different armed groups within Lebanon itself. And some are Christian, they're Druze, they're all half the problems of the world are done in the name of God and our different religions, all from Morocco clear to Mindanao, clear across the sub-Asian area. There are religious differences, and I would be concerned not only about a Christian enclave there, but other enclaves enclaves also of other religious groups. I hope we can work that out.
I'm not trying to come across as the Christian spokesman here, but they happen to be the minority, and they are the group that basically we've sent the Marines there to protect, which is why I'm asking. It's a question about how willing are you to use force in this situation.
I would disagree with you that we've sent the Marines there only for the Christians there. Is to try and, according to this administration, 1,700 Marines are supposed to somehow enable them to have territorial integrity of Lebanon, which is wrong. I, number one, would not have sent the Marines in there on an impossible mission, number one. Right now, I think we should be getting them back together as part of a multinational force, redefining that kind of a mission, getting the UN people up there so we can truly start phasing our people out. That's the way out of that.
Professor Vogel has the next question for Jesse Jackson.
Reverend Jackson, in our basic industries, we all know we're in a great deal of trouble. Some people estimate our steel is at about 30% of capacity. Our small automobiles cost about $2,000 a year to produce, more than Japan's. How are we going to keep competitiveness, modernize, deal with the fact that we have a lot of unemployment, and keep free trade all at the same time?
Number one, if you increase the education of our children, you increase our ability to trade and be competitive. There's a correlation between the cutback on education investment and the trade deficit. Number two, those corporations that receive our tax investment that ought to be used as an incentive for them to reinvest in this economy, reindustrialize this economy, and retrain this workforce. In effect, what Reaganomics has done has been to reward these corporations with a record-setting budget, record-setting tax break, and they've simply merged or acquired, replaced people with machines, put a technocracy over democracy, and tried to make the workers feel guilty, or took the profits and exported our jobs to cheap labor markets abroad. And those jobs abroad do not represent better labor, they represent cheaper labor. And I think that if there's a correlation between our tax investment and our return, we'll become stronger internally and thus more competitive. And I choose competition over content legislation.
What I wonder is how we're going to, I don't quite understand, is what you're going to do about these machines. You complained about replacing people with machines, but presumably machines are much more efficient and operate much faster. Now, are you going to turn back productivity increases?
Well, I don't accept that premise. The idea that you replace people with machines because machines are more efficient, and machines don't come to work late, and machines don't get drunk, but they also they don't buy clothes either. They don't buy cars. And they don't feed families, and so the human investment must be superior. I would say that if we in fact shifted our focus to the high production economy, to put America back to work, to rebuild these bridges, to end these slums, and rebuild these cities, and build mass transportation systems, we would have more jobs than we would have people to fill those jobs. So we must shift our focus to rebuild America in the slums. Ending slums must be the new frontier, not spacewalks.
What if the labor in other countries...
Sorry, Professor Vogel, I'm going to have to jump in here and move along to Mr. Beecher, who has the next question for George McGovern.
Mr. McGovern, the administration has charged that Syria, Iran, and the Soviet Union are serious obstacles to the restoration of stability in Lebanon. What would you urge the United States to do to put pressure on those three countries to back off and let the Lebanese solve their own problems?
I think the question is a good one because it brings us back to one of the central issues, the central issue in the Middle East, which is the Arab-Israeli dispute. I think that's one of the unfortunate things about our deepening involvement in Lebanon. It's diverted the attention to what is essentially a secondary issue from this basic problem that's been disrupting the peace of the Middle East. I think all of those countries that you mentioned, the Soviet Union, Syria, Lebanon, all of them have to be involved, along with Israel, in trying to negotiate some kind of a resolution of the Arab-Israeli problem. Until we confront that, I don't think there can be any stability in the Middle East.
A few moments ago, you spoke of mistakes of the last 35 years by Republicans and Democrats alike in their attitude toward and their approach to the world problem. There's a new world problem emerging, and that is national terrorism. Terrorism is an instrument of foreign policy by certain states. How, as president, would you propose to combat that new problem?
Well, I think we have to recognize that it's an awful lot easier to deplore terrorism than it is to end it. It's very difficult to get a handle on it. The present administration must have learned that because they announced in January of 1981 that was going to be the #1 priority of Reagan foreign policy. It would no longer be human rights. It would be ending terrorism. And over the last 3 years, more Americans have died at the hands of terrorists than in the previous administration. So it's an enormously difficult problem. I think one way that we might reduce some of the terrorist damage in terms of our own country is to address the pain and the frustration and the anger of the third world more effectively than we have. Terrorism is the weapon of the third world. We all deplore it, but it's their substitute for strategic weapons.
I'm going to have to jump in, Mr. Governor, I'm sorry. Gregory Treverton has the next question for Alan Cranston.
Mr. Cranston, you've been very sharply critical of the military emphasis in Mr. Reagan's policies, particularly toward Central America. At the same time, the Soviet Union does seem to regard Central America as our backyard. They seem to go out of their way to make clear to us that they aren't about to respond no matter what we do in Central America. My question is, if we pursue the kind of military policies you favor, don't we run the risk of creating the impression all around the world that we're weak and can be pushed around?
No, I don't believe that the fundamental reasons for the unrest and the bloodshed and the revolution in Central America comes from communism. The origins lie in terrible poverty to which America has been largely indifferent, and which Ronald Reagan refuses to recognize, and from inequality and injustice and military and other forms of tyranny. The communists simply come in to ride on that for their own purposes as parasites taking advantage of it. To deal with the root causes, we have to deal with the poverty, we have to deal with the tyranny, and become a country that recognizes the need for social change and doesn't block it if the revolutionaries are backed by communism. We should become a force for peaceful change and find ways to help that change come about in Central America.
If we seek this evolutionary change, the problem, of course, is that it isn't about to happen soon, and it may lead in the process to leftist, Marxist, Cuban allies in the region. And you would say that that isn't a problem in the sense of America's prestige or sense of strength in the world.
Well, I think we should be less interested in prestige and more interested in justice and in peace and in progress toward those goals. And the way to achieve that is by helping those who are seeking democracy and peaceful change. And I think we should take the advice of Mexico, Panama, Colombia, and Venezuela and stop seeking a military intervention and join them in seeking a peaceful solution there.
We have just a few moments left in this segment of the debate, and Karen Elliott House will have a chance to tie up any loose ends that she
I
chooses.
think we left some fairly significant loose ends on three critical areas of the world: Lebanon, Central America, and oil. So let me please be brief. Start with you, Mr. Jackson. Under what conditions would you send troops to save the Western world's oil supply in Saudi Arabia?
If our interests were threatened by outside forces, we should use our strategic military alliance with our allies to stop outside intervention. If there were an internal drive to overthrow what the majority saw as some form of despotism, we should not step in the middle of a civil war so quickly. We must stand back long enough to watch that adjustment and then try to ally with the new powers that be. And I make a distinction between outside intervention and that of internal change.
Mr. Mondale, is there any situation which would lead you to send troops to secure the situation in Lebanon? Are you just for getting them out, period, and let nature take its course?
I have several approaches that I think should be taken at the same time. First of all, I think we're long overdue, but we should be pressing Jamal to open up and bring what is in fact a majority into his government, still a minority government. Number two, we should have an international effort to put tremendous pressure on Syria that's acting totally irresponsibly in that area. Number three, we should try to bring in third countries, bring up those UNIFIL forces to provide additional help to give them more time, leaving the naval forces offshore. And finally, I think we should be unequivocal and clear about a permanent and solid strategic cooperation agreement with Israel.
Let me, Mr. Glenn, you seem to be saying that the situation in El Salvador has deteriorated so far that we should let the revolution take its course. Is that what you were saying earlier, or would you like to
No, that was
correct
not what I was saying, not in those words. What I was saying was that 2/3 of the deaths since '79, the tragedy of all those 30,000 deaths, 2/3 of the deaths have come from the right-wing paramilitary groups operating often with impunity out of the government circles themselves. And what I'm saying is that if we expect to cut down on the flow of people into the guerrilla movement down there, we're going to have to stop that kind of tragedy in the first place. That's the reason I had the amendment I had passed in the Foreign Relations Committee that would require the government of El Salvador to come forward with a plan of how they control that kind of slaughter so we can get the rest of it all stopped. It's just when you have people repressed like that, and then we have death squads going out and murdering people by the thousands, it just drives them off into the hills. So
Okay,
I think that's the first thing we have to do.
I'm going to have to jump in here, Senator. Next tonight, we are going to give each candidate a chance to ask a question of another candidate. The candidate asking the question knows whom he'll be asking, but the candidate answering does not know. The first question will be asked by Mr. McGovern, and it goes to Mr. Glenn.
Great.
Steady, George, steady. John, for almost 30 years now, I guess it is 30 years, since the end of the Korean War, we've had some 40,000 American troops in South Korea, notwithstanding the fact that South Korea is a more prosperous and a larger country than North Korea. Is this permanent? Are we stuck there forever with 40,000 troops in Korea, or can you envision their systematic withdrawal in the near future?
Well, I don't know about the near future, but what I see as a method of withdrawal there, and I do not see them as being there permanently, and I've been in Korea a number of times. In fact, I fought there during the Korean War and lived there for a year, so I'm very familiar with that situation. And what I would like to see happen there is I hope we can get negotiations going between North and South Korea so they get a better control along the border there and some agreement there so we can start lessening tensions. Our 40,000 people there are in a blocking position down the Kaesong Valley, which is the natural approach course to Seoul. And if we are in that particular position, I think we probably have been responsible already for preventing war in that area by the very fact that our troops were there. Now, that does not mean that I would leave them there permanently. I'm hoping they can get negotiations started. There has recently been some indication that they might be willing to talk on a more productive basis, but as long as the North is lined up along that border in an offensive position, artillery forward, all of these things that indicate a readiness to go, I don't think that we should pull out of there immediately.
Mr. Hart now has a question that he'll direct to Mr. Cranston.
Alan, you and I worked very hard to seek the ratification of SALT II, and I think we both agree that its failure is a disaster for this country. To what do you attribute the failure of that treaty? Was it a failure of support on the part of Democrats, including some on this platform, or was it the failure of the Carter administration to push harder?
I think the Carter-Mondale administration made some very serious mistakes in handling the SALT II treaty. They made a mistake in changing everything when there could have been a swift ratification of what Kissinger and Ford had started, an abrupt change. They mishandled the Cuban incident of the troops there, and that it was two moves that made the Carter-Mondale administration look rather weak. There was opposition from one of the people on this platform to the SALT treaty at that time, and that hurt.
Who?
The final blow, John Fritz Hollings, two people, two members of the panel, Fritz and John. The final blow, of course, was the invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviet Union, and that so poisoned the climate and the relationship that it made ratification impossible.
There'll be rebuttal time at the end, incidentally. Mr. Mondale now has a question that he'll direct to Mr. Hart.
Senator, you've been the leader, one of the leaders in the military reform movement, trying to make certain that our military forces are shaped for the needs of the future, and I think all of us admire your leadership in this field. One of the big issues today is how should the Navy be shaped? We have the layman doctrine that builds larger and larger ships, seems to have an unlimited demand for what they would be used for. And I think you speak for many of us when you want a reshaped Navy that meets our needs. Would you speak to that issue?
This nation is, and to a degree always has been, an island nation. Increasingly in the 1980s, 90s, and the 21st century, our ability to protect our own interest and to engage in international commerce is dependent upon our ability to control the sea lines of communication. The Reagan administration, I'm afraid, is perpetuating past mistakes, and they are building a fleet to combat the Imperial Japanese Navy. The problem is that is not the fleet that the Soviet Union has built. We are now confronting an overwhelming Soviet Navy, and the ships we're building are not equipped to offset that. I think increasingly our administration, our government and Democratic administration is going to have to break the Navy bureaucracy and move it into the future, as we are a whole lot of the other services, in order to protect this nation's real interests in the future.
Mr. Jackson has the next question, and he directs it to Mr. McGovern.
One of the concerns is that we can espouse new foreign policy, a peace policy as opposed to a war policy. Unless we remove the hawks that keep voting for it, we cannot get change. the South is still using schemes to undercut the Voting Rights Act of '65. The use of second primaries, the use of gerrymandering, annexation, at-large schemes. What would you do to appeal to all Democrats to support and enforce the Voting Rights Act, which would in fact give us a new balance because blacks, Hispanics, and women would replace hawks and boll weevils?
I want to congratulate you on bringing civil rights into foreign policy. I think there is a valid tie in here, and that Reverend Jackson's point is clear. If you leave unenforced the Voting Rights Act, that has the practical effect of perpetuating a number of people in the United States Senate who have been least helpful on the grounds of international peace, on environmental issues, and other humane objectives. I think there are some problems with the enforcement of the Voting Rights Act, and you've done a good job of underscoring them. One is the double primary, that is the 50+1 primaries that we have in some of the states in the Deep South. It has the effect of making it very difficult for blacks to be elected to high office. Secondly, the dual registration that has people traveling 75 or 80 miles in order to register not once but twice. And third, the inaccessibility sometimes of voting referees. I think all of those things need to be strengthened in order to see that the Voting Rights Act is carried out the way the Congress intended.
So my real point is that if you enforce civil rights at home, you can have enough leverage to have peace abroad. Unless we are able to knock out the hawks, then we, of course, cannot be able to bring in the doves.
Well, I agree with that. I think somebody defined a bipartisan foreign policy the other day as an alliance among the hawks of both parties. And it's that, it's that kind of bipartisanship I'd like to end.
Our next question is from Mr. Glenn, and he will direct it to Mr. Hollings.
Fritz, you know, we have the present administration that has, for the first time since right after World War II, we do not have a single arms control negotiation in progress right now. On the other hand, we have those among us who say they would end the arms race with a single phone call. What would be your policy?
My policy would be, number one, change my attitude as president. The President of the United States came in with this confrontational, strident kind of approach of not only perhaps blockading Cuba, limited nuclear war, firing warning nuclear shots. The fact is, he frightened 700,000 Americans spilling onto the main street of New York City. They weren't frightened by Brezhnev at that time. They were frightened by their own president. I'd cool the rhetoric. I would make positive and calm and attractive kind of proposals which had an advantage to both sides. Specifically, my arms control proposal submitted last summer to the Society of Editors and Publishers for Intermediate was praised by Ambassador Cygnus, the arms control director for President Carter, as the best first step proposal that he had seen, and others interested in that particular field. I would work with our allies. We have not worked closely with our allies, and I see now they're just beginning general rally to bring us all in, working together on intermediate and strategic at the same time.
You get a chance to ask the next question, Mr. Hollings, and it's directed to Reverend Jackson.
Oh. Foreign policy does
Remember,
have...
we're both from South Carolina.
That's right. And we both believe in this, and I'm going to give you an easy one because I want your help. There is a there's a civil rights aspect to foreign policy. The greatest civil wrong, the most advantage of societies depending upon the black and the least advantaged in our society for its defenses, is wrong, and I have supported and strived for a draft for the last 3 years. Reverend Jackson, you visited the troops at the front line last September where over 50% are black or minorities. Will you help me with my draft, or do you believe only the Rainbow Coalition should give their lives for their country?
Well, I think that I did not support the draft because I think that when we prepare for war, then next we engage in war. I think that the reasons that so many black and poor are in the armed services is because they're locked out of educational and job training options. So that bringing in the draft will not help balance out the racial makeup in the Army, bringing in education and technological options will give them more domestic economic options. Most of them are not in the service, not to save the country, but to have a job.
Our next question is from Mr. Cranston, and he directs it to Mr. Mondale.
Fritz, the Carter-Mondale administration pushed the MX and the ridiculous racetrack basing mode. You pushed the Pershings and the cruises in Europe, and you advocate a 5% increase in the defense budget. With that kind of a record, how do you give the American people confidence that you will end the arms race?
Well, first of all, I think my record is substantially different than that suggested. I have, number one, been involved in every arms control fight over 25 years. I feel deeply about it. I made the freeze a central issue in my campaign. I've got a strong 12-point platform. Secondly, contrary to what you suggest, I very much supported the NITSE Walk in the Woods agreement, which, if completed, would have prevented the deployment of the Pershings and put in the cruises and then moved ahead for a further reduction. I'm against the MX. I've always been for a single warhead mobile missile. I helped lead the fight against Merving in the late 60s. I wish we'd won. I'm against the B-1 bomber. I wish everyone at this place was against it. And what I want is a nation of strength, but to use that strength to keep the peace, and I've got the experience to get it done.
We have a couple of minutes before we move on to the next round. We have a few moments for rebuttal time. Is there anyone who would like to respond who feels perhaps aggrieved by an earlier answer? Let me give Senator Glenn a chance to respond to some of the earlier comments on him. Okay.
Yeah, let me just make it. Would you like to have some time, John? Could I?
Quick. We'll come
This
back to
leadership
you
is paralyzed. Let me make a point. You know,
We have 3 minutes. Go ahead.
The question was on SALT II. At the time of SALT II, I don't think anyone went into any more detail than I did on our ability to monitor or not monitor SALT II. Joint Chiefs of Staff talked about verification, but 3 of the members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said at that time we could not adequately monitor SALT II. We had lost our satellite capability, we had lost our tracking sites in Iran. I would not trust the Soviets to automatically live up to agreements without us being able to monitor. And that's the reason I voted as I did in the Foreign Relations Committee. I said at that time that if we regained that capability, I would then be for it. I am. I'm very surprised that other members of this group here would trust the Soviets without knowing that we could monitor them. I will not do that. If I am president, we will sign agreements, but we will be able to verify what they are doing.
Mr. Mondale?
And well, among those people that were beguiled by trust were the Joint Chiefs of Staff, every one of them, the head of the intelligence agency, the NSA, who went up and testified that they were certain that this was verifiable. It was verifiable.
But they could not monitor.
They knew enough to say that it was adequately verifiable, and they all testified that way, which is why almost everybody on the Democratic side in the Senate, most of us anyway, supported it, and it was a solid agreement. I wanted to make one point here, if I could, to Senator Hart. You know, no president is going to be perfect, but on the issue of human rights, I think President Carter deserves a lot of credit, and I think history is going to deal very kindly with what he did. You take the Philippines. We went over there. I went over there as vice president. I met with Cardinal Sin. I met with the dissidents publicly. I both publicly and privately pressed Mr. Marcos to undo martial law, to release Aquino.
Mr. Mondale,
and some of these things we really tried, and we should get some credit for.
Going to have to jump in and give Mr. Hollings a quick response.
Yes, sir. With respect to SALT I and SALT II, the entire Senate practically were beguiled, plus the president and the entire administration by SALT I, whereby in 1979, Dr. Kissinger testified that SALT I did not work. It actually worked the other way around, and he wanted to assume some of the responsibility. Looking at SALT II, it was not an agreement that bound us or either party on missiles, warheads, or launches. Launches were not defined, and Article 4, Section 10, second agreed statement said you could use decoys, and therefore the warheads themselves were not controlled. And then there was disparities with the backfire and the B-52. They control their ballistic missiles, but our cruise missiles, but not their ballistic missiles. There were all kind of disparities, and we killed it. We killed that thing. I can tell you, we had the votes, and that's why President Carter didn't bring it up. I was one of the leaders.
Fritz, we're not in the Senate. No unlimited debate here.
Right on to the next.
You don't like what I'm saying.
Next segment of questioning. And the candidates again will have a chance to ask one another questions. The pairings are different this time, but once again, the candidate asking the question knows whom he'll be asking. The candidate answering does not. Mr. Jackson has a question for Mr. Glenn.
Been waiting for this a long time. Mr. Right Stuff. Interestingly enough, with the journalists who've raised questions and counter questions, and the students who asked them, we have finished 2/3 of a discussion on foreign policy and left out 2/3 of the world, which is fundamental to our foreign policy problem. 1/2 of all human beings are Asian, one half of them Chinese. 1 of every 8 human beings are African, 1/4 of them Nigerian. We have trade quotas against African people. South Africa is a state of terror, and yet we've ignored 2/3 of the world. What would you do as president to bring third world into direct dialogue with American policy, foreign policy?
Well, good question. We have a number of great tides running in the world with regard to foreign policy we have not yet addressed tonight, and that's one of them, is our relationship with the third world. I mentioned earlier some of the religious differences and the new technological differences that we must be sharing with the third world if we are to ever have peace. Much of the third world exists with not a real infrastructure in between, a middle class as we call it in this country, either the haves and the have-nots. And I think if we can do a better job of helping educate those people, of helping to eradicate some of the sources of poverty, move them into better trade posture, many of those nations are nations that do have some of the scarce resources that the modern world needs. The shortage of oil was but one of those that is now a very scarce resource and was the subject of some discussion a little while ago.
Going to have to jump in here. I'm sorry, Mr. Glenn. We have to keep to our time schedule. Mr. Mondale to Mr. Cranston.
Senator, this past session, the Congress finally turned down a proposed production of poison nerve gas, binary gases. You opposed it, I opposed it, several at this platform opposed it, over the argument that the existing stocks were said to be unsafe. I agree with your position. Would you tell us why you took it?
I want to see us stop the arms race, stop developing weapons that are of such vast destructive capacity. I do not believe we need nerve gas. We want to negotiate an end to those weapons, to nuclear weapons, and incidentally, we also want to negotiate to reduce conventional weapons with the Soviet Union so that we don't need to replace nuclear weapons with more conventional weaponry. As far as the safety factor of those present stockpiled nerve gas weapons are concerned, that is not an adequate reason to start production of more new, more deadly weapons.
Mr. McGovern now with a question for Mr. Hollings.
Senator Hollings, as you know, about 70% of our entire defense budget is to project our power overseas, not for the defense of our own shores. Recognizing that at the end of World War II, Europe was in ruins and weak and impoverished, we sent in some 300,000 of our ground forces to bolster the NATO system. Do you think the time has come, given the prosperity of our European allies, when they could carry more of their own military manpower needs so that we might reduce that heavy commitment?
Senator McGovern, I would hope so. I agree, and Reverend Jackson and I talked about this, the disparity with the Japanese, less than 1%, even with the 6% increase, should be taking on more of the burden. And also in NATO with respect to the cost, the economic burden there. With respect to the number of troops 15 years ago, I buddied up with Senator Mansfield to start making a studied payback, but now the alliance itself is threatened by the Soviet with respect to their maneuvers on arms control talk. That was the whole thing with respect to the intermediate negotiations going on, and fortunately this country prevailed in the sense that I have favored putting those Pershing IIs and cruise missiles out there as a counterpart and defense for the Europeans against the SS-20s. That's given stability to the NATO alliance, and they have not fractured us as they had hoped to do. Now we can re-strengthen them and they take on more of their particular responsibilities. The answer is positively yes, we can start bringing them back. But it's like you asked a little while ago, someone on Korea. Are we succeeding now with those troops in Korea? North Korea is coming there and they're beginning to talk. That's a success. We have held together the alliance with these troops, and we don't want to do anything to disturb the strength of that alliance. And if there's been one thing that's come out of all of this arms control negotiation, I'm sorry for its failure, is that the alliance itself has been strengthened.
Mr. Hart with a question for Mr. McGovern.
Setup.
No setup.
George, you provided powerful moral and political leadership for this country on the issue that many, not most of my generation, felt was the dominant issue of our time and still pervades, I think, to a sad degree, our foreign policy, and that was our involvement in Vietnam. You watched year after year as Democrats failed and delayed and delayed and delayed to come out against that war. Do you see the same pattern in terms of our involvement in Lebanon and the troops that we've had there?
I do indeed. As you know, Gary, it was said in '72 our problem was we were ahead of our time. Somebody said 10 years, that's why I'm back. I think in the case of Lebanon, we've gone through the same cycle. Almost no protest at the time the Marines were put in there. You protested it, a few other people did, but most people went along with it. And even after we started accepting casualties among these Marines, the Congress, I think mistakenly, voted to give President Reagan 18 months to do whatever he wanted to. It was a perversion of the War Powers Act. I think the time to have taken those Marines out of there was when it first became clear that it was an impossible military mission. Not wait until 239 of them are blown up by a terrorist bomb. Someone said here earlier tonight we lost another Marine yesterday. The count is now up to 259. And I wonder how long some people are going to have to wait before they think the time has come to stop worrying about saving face and begin saving lives in Lebanon.
Our next question is from Mr. Cranston to Mr. Hart.
Gary, one of your new ideas is the build-up, build-down nuclear approach. How do you defend that approach when Ronald Reagan, Jesse Helms, and Gordon Humphrey are using it to block the nuclear freeze?
Well, first of all, as you know, Alan, was not my idea, but it's one that I supported while we were negotiating the freeze. And in fact, as you'll recall, I voted against the bill down when it was put forward by the administration and those same people as an alternative to the freeze. I have less difficulty reconciling those two positions, I think, than you would reconciling your support for the freeze and the so-called Jackson-Warner resolution, which was the administration's proposal to prevent any kind of real negotiations from going forward. I think while we're negotiating a freeze, that there's nothing wrong with having a requirement that requires both sides to destroy two existing systems for every one that's being built. And that is my position, and until we get the freeze, it will be.
Mr. Hollings now with a question for Mr. Mondale.
Vice President Mondale, a moment ago you were listing the weapons systems that you are against. I know, having had the pleasure of serving with you in the United States Senate, you oppose the cruise missile, the Minuteman missile, the Trident, the battle tank, the F-14. You propose cuts in troop strength. Just what weapons system do you favor?
As a matter of fact, all my public career, I have been for a sensible defense. For example, I'm against the MX because it's destabilizing and dangerous. But I'm for building the Midget Man, which is stabilizing and makes sense. I'm against the B-1, but I am for the stealth bomber because the stealth is a modern weapon that takes us into the future. It frustrates the Soviet defense systems. I'm for an enhanced. I'm for an enhanced. I'm trying not to look at it. How many fingers, Jeff. So I'm for an enhanced conventional force structure in NATO because I think it provides not only more stability but brings down the risk of nuclear war. I am for about a 4% real buildup in national strength, which is a very substantial increase, because I believe the Soviet threat is such that in addition to doing everything we can to reduce tensions through arms control, we must also have an adequate defense. I've served on the National Security Council. I know what I'm talking about, and what is crying out today is to get a sensible defense. This Reagan has taken a candy store approach to defense. He buys everything that anybody can think of. They can't manage it, they're bankrupting the country, and what we need in this nation is somebody who's got sense, and you're looking at him. Thank
you. Okay, one more question before closing statements. Mr. Glenn puts it to Mr. Jackson.
Yeah. So to speak. I mean, that wasn't the right kind of language.
Colonel Jackson, you were very successful with your trip over to Syria. And we all compliment you, of course, for getting Lieutenant Goodman out. Anytime we get a prisoner of war out, why, it's a step forward.
Tell George Wills that.
But I wonder if you were, president today, how would you handle this? Would you encourage more U.S. citizens to go and do things as you did? Would you prohibit that? Would you pull their passports? What would be your view toward other private citizens doing the same thing you did?
I would keep making the distinction between a moral appeal and a negotiation. One negotiates only with government portfolio because you can exchange one item or one person for another. In our case, we did not have government portfolio, did not attempt to negotiate and offer something for something. We simply took a moral appeal with a superior argument, asking Mr. Assad to seize that moment, to break that cycle of pain, and to relieve some tension between our government and Syria, because it was my belief that with Syria occupying 60% of Lebanon, any equation that leaves the Syrian factor out will not resolve that situation. So in the main, I would support moral appeals by citizens or business people, but not negotiations.
Finally, tonight we have time for a brief closing statement from each candidate, and we begin with Mr. McGovern.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to use a statement from one of the most thoughtful Americans, former Senator Frank Church, who I regret to say is critically ill, but who said some things to Dave Broder, a columnist, the other day that I'm in full agreement with, and I think it's a good point on which me to end my remarks. Senator Church said, "Until we learn to live with revolution, we will continue to blunder, and it will work to the Soviets' advantage. It will put them on the winning side while we put ourselves on the side of rotten, corrupt regimes that end up losing. And each time one of those regimes is overthrown, it feeds the paranoia in this country about the spread of communism. It furthers the premise of the national security state, which means more militarism, more censorship, more spending, more deficits, and more casualties." This is what I fear is ahead of us if the American people re-elect Ronald Reagan to another 4 years as the director of the foreign policy and military policy of this country.
I'm
More
going to have to jump in,
intervention,
Mr.
more
McGovern.
confrontation,
Mr. Hollings,
more
your
war.
closing statement.
Our foreign policy depends, of course, upon our economic strength, our capability of our defenses, the military, and, of course, the values of our people. I've learned this under Frank Church, under Bill Fulbright. Someone asked how I prepared for the debate. I said, with 18 years in the United States Senate, debating every particular issue and voting on it, serving as the Secretary of the Interparliamentary Union when we had that first conference in Moscow years ago, serving on the Law of the Sea Conference, working on the various treaties that we've had, and discussing it with all of the best of minds from Harvard and around this world. I've learned to listen, and I've learned to realize that what we need in foreign policy is not only realism, but continuity, and more than anything else, a respect for our allies and less confrontation and stridency towards the Soviets. rather trying to develop a web of relationships with the Soviet every chance.
Mr. Cranston.
We are entering, or are now in, one of the most dangerous times in American history, indeed probably the most dangerous time in world history. So it's good that we focus upon foreign policy and defense tonight. The arms race is totally on the loose. We are moving weapons closer to the Soviet Union. They are moving weapons closer to our shore. There are no negotiations going on, and we have only one arms control treaty of a limited nature in effect. We have a bellicose president. We have bellicose leadership in the Soviet Union. And for most of the past 40 years, we have had a Cold War mentality in our government. We need a wholly new approach to the issues of war and peace. And instead of having questions put to us, when would you use American force, under what circumstances? We should never answer that question. You leave something out, you invite aggression. You put something in, you seemingly commit to the use of force. We should be seeking a world where we do not need to use American force and have a stable, secure peace.
Mr. Mondale.
The other day, President Reagan ridiculed these debates that we've been having. And I think he's as wrong on that as he's been in his utter disregard for the need for a sensible defense and for the pursuit of arms control. The fact of it is that those of us on this platform seeking the presidency on the Democratic ticket have participated in more debates and more public discussions than any presidential candidates in the history of our country. That doesn't make us weaker, that makes us stronger. We're shaping a mandate for our future. We're making the issue about this reckless administration that has created this much more dangerous world, and we're talking specifically in hard facts from experience and background as to how we would deal with this complex problem and reduce the risk of war. In my opinion, this president has got it all wrong. These kinds of discussions build public trust and public support, and he's in for a big surprise this coming November.
Sorry,
you stumped on my back. Stumped on my
Number one, to be consistent and have credibility, we must measure human rights by one yardstick, whether it is in Africa, Central America, or Middle East. Our moral authority depends upon our consistency. Secondly, well, to stop all the demagoguery about Russia, as if they are different human beings than we are, we lost about 500,000 people in the Second World War. They lost about 22 million. They want to live too. The only reason that we are alive tonight, Russia chose not to mow us down. We cannot stop Russia from annihilating us. They cannot stop us from annihilating them. To face that reality is to move us beyond talking about trust between two leaders into a war prevention center manned by scientists, as opposed to a hotline teletext that's antiquated. Lastly, we've spent all the night talking about east-west, when in fact there's a north-south reality where these hot spots are taking place. I would say, lastly, that we must somehow revive confidence in the American people. Say this: suffering breeds character. Character breeds faith, and the end faith will not disappoint. It is with that spirit that we can confront these policies.
Mr. Glenn.
Thank you.
Please hold your applause.
During foreign policy crisis, our whole American policy, our whole American fortune for the future may well depend on the character, the expertise of that person sitting in the Oval Office. And whether there's a steadfastness there, a steadiness, or political courage, or independence may be the determining factors as to whether we live or die. I've had some 40 years' experience in foreign policy, having been through 2 wars, been in international trade myself, been on the Foreign Relations Committee, have visited many of these heads of state in different places we mentioned this evening. But I think the most lasting impression I have out of all of this background and experience is of those friends of mine who really risked their lives, who died because of belief in this country, and that we might have a better and a safer world for this nation of ours. And to me, that's what foreign policy is all about. We've discussed specifics here this evening of ICBMs in Lebanon and specific cases right now. But the real issue we all have before us is for your children and mine, the kind of world we would leave them, and we cannot let them down.
Mr. Hart.
There is a great deal that unites all of us here, particularly in our opposition to Reagan foreign and domestic policies. But that unity should not gloss over some real differences. I'm on this platform tonight really for 2 reasons. One, because the President John Kennedy, challenged my generation to do something for its country and not to seek what that country could do for us, which I'm afraid some candidates are doing. Second, it's because of the experience my generation had in opposing our involvement in Southeast Asia, a fundamental understanding that political leadership which is based upon caution is not going to solve this country's foreign policy problems in Lebanon, in Grenada, in Central America, or anywhere else. What is needed in the 1980s is leadership based upon boldness, a boldness which understands intervention militarily all around the world is not going to put this country forward, to put forward what we believe at home and make that the same thing we claim to believe abroad.
Thank you very much. This concludes our debate on foreign policy issues. We'd like to thank all our Democratic presidential candidates for joining us here at the Kennedy School tonight, and to our audience here at the Kennedy School and at home. This debate was sponsored by the Institute of Politics at Harvard University and by the Boston Globe in association with WCVB-TV. From the Kennedy School of Government in Cambridge, Massachusetts, I'm Peter Mehigan. Thanks for being with us tonight. Good night.
You did a good job there, Fritz. You did a good job. You did. That's good. You said it. You looking at it. Hey, John. Good job. Thank you very much. No, it was excellent. That's the way to do it. I thought I'd be 60 tonight. All right, let me beat it.
Yeah. I've got a, hey Joe, I've got a call in. Why don't you, I got a.
I'm in no rush, I'll just watch
Hey, you're a great actor. You're a great actor. You've got the qualifications.
Go ahead. That's my man. See, I do it.